Good evening and welcome. My name is Adam Tooze, and as Director of the European Institute, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening, which is in celebration of Sheri Berman and her book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the present. This event is part of the New Books in the Arts and Sciences series. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Maison Française and Shani Pierre, who is hosting us this evening, as she has done so many times before. The Office of the Divisional Deans, the Society of Fellows, and the Heyman Centre for the Humanities. It's truly a great pleasure to be here to discuss Sheri Berman's new book. Sheri is Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. She works on European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism. She writes frequently for such publications as the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. Sheri is the author of The Primacy of Politics, Social Democracy and the Making of Europe's 20th Century, and also The Social Democratic Moment, Ideas and Politics in the Making of Interwar Europe. Her new book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, is a tour de force history of Europe's political development from the age of the French Revolution through the turmoil of the 19th and 20th century to the moment of apparent triumph in 1989 and the full complexity of what has happened since. We were talking upstairs just before coming down here about the difficulty of finishing a book like this. The story just refuses to end. And it refuses in particular if, like Sheri, you treat it in its full complexity. This is not a simple story of triumph. It's not a simple story of the history of West European politics. It's not a story that centers only on the big countries, quote unquote, like France and Germany. It's a story that takes in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. I particularly commend to you the chapters on Spain, which for Sheri serves a particularly crucial function. It really is, I think, going to stand as a landmark contribution in our understanding of Europe's political development at a moment when it could hardly be more salient to have historical perspective on Europe's political development. And there is a book sale outside. So after this no doubt fascinating session this evening, you should all go outside and pick up a copy and get Sheri to sign it for you. We have two wonderful panelists to discuss Sheri's book with her. Jack Snyder is the Robert and Renée Belfer Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia. He's the author, as you will know, of numerous books on political science and strategy, including Electing to Fight, Why Emerging Democracies Go to War and From Voting to Violence, Democratization and Nationalist Conflict. Jack has also recently edited with Alexander Stille of the Harriman Center, Ranking the World Grading States as a Tool of Global Governance. And alongside him, we're very pleased to welcome Alexander Stille, who is São Paulo Professor of International Journalism at Columbia and a contributor to a wide range of publications such as the New York Times, the La Repubblica, the New Yorker Magazine, and the New York Review of Books. He's also the author of several books on Italian history and political life. He was telling us just before we sat down about the horrors of, well, the sort of delirious experience of interviewing Silvio Berlusconi. But his books include Benevolence and Betrayal, 5 Italian Jewish families under fascism, and more recently The Sack of Rome, how a beautiful European country with a fabled history and a storied culture was taken over by a man named Silvio Berlusconi. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who was also on the programme from NYU, of course, great expert on Italian fascism, was going to join us for the panel this evening, but she sends her regrets. She's had a medical emergency, which means she won't be here, but we're assured that her health is recovering and she'll be just fine. But tonight was not the night. Alexander Stille will moderate the first phase of the discussion, and Jack, I think, will lead off with comments before Sheri responds. But before I give the floor to them, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
A couple of years, she's been working away and done an extraordinary job of synthesizing in considerable detail with a lot of insight nearly 400 years of history, starting with the Ancien regime under Louis XIV, Tudor England up to the very present. And so it's an amazing reference for any of us. So if you need to catch up on the complexities of politics in Wilhelmine Germany, or remember what was in the Reform Act of 1832, and or the pains and vicissitudes of the French Republic. They're all there and told with clarity and intelligence and insight. I think, in a way, the epigram for the last chapter of the book might stand as the epigram for the whole book. A quotation, interestingly, from Marx: "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." And so I think one of the major points of the book is the importance of the weight of history in this story of the halting progress of democracy. And I kept reading it with, it's very much of an historical text, and I will throw this out as a question for Sheri when she gets around to her part of it. Since I know Sheri is a political scientist, I was reading this historical account knowing that somewhere lurking behind there is the mind of a political scientist who is maybe working towards some grand covering law or theory behind this history, and was trying to sort of suss out as I was reading what that might be. One of the things that's interesting, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, is there's this frequent tension in the various stories she tells in these different countries about, on the one hand, one sees consistently through the different countries what I see as a kind of narrative of modernization, of industrialization and urbanization that's happening in these different countries, which is creating pressures of democratization as more people move to cities, enter into the literate urban industrial class, and make demands on the political system. At the same time, you have what's happening on an institutional level in these different places and countries that all begin in some version of what she refers to as the Ancien Régime, which takes a different form in the different countries, and how those institutions do or do not adapt to these pressures for democratization that are happening. And then there's a kind of level which I think one might think of as being sort of political or social capital that exists or doesn't exist in these different countries that eases or makes more difficult the kind of transition. One of the things I think that's very sobering in Sheri's account that comes off very clearly, which she makes altogether explicit in the final chapter, is one realizes how unusual liberal democracy is. Most of us grew up in an era in which liberal democracy appeared to be the norm. It appeared to be the template. Pretty much everyone in this room is old enough to remember the triumphant days of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, in which it appeared that liberal democracy was going to be the model that would become universal around the world. And Sheri's book reminds us that, in fact, it's much more of a kind of, is a far more unusual combination, that most processes of democratization have been long, complicated, bloody, often failed. They've slid backwards, that even in England, which is the kind of classic success story, the sort of Goldilocks, just right formula of democratization, was preceded by 2 civil wars, one of them very bloody, So she reminds us that, as I said, most attempts fail, and then there's often a kind of discontinuity between democracy and liberalization, and Sheri spends quite a bit of time distinguishing between these two things, that there are regimes which create rule of law without an expanded franchise, and plenty of regimes which are what she would term, and others would term, electoral democracies, where elections take place, but the rules of the game are extremely uncertain and often not respected in order to guarantee a particular outcome. Then I was interested to encounter a section where she refers to sequencing and sequencing matter, which made me remember that we're fortunate to have these two on the same panel, because they conducted an interesting intellectual debate on sequencing in democratization in Iraq, on whether there was a kind of, whether one could talk about the creation of a happier kind of sequencing between institution building and electoral democracy. So there is attention to the question of sequencing. And then, obviously, something that's very much on the mind of everyone now is what can we expect in this, what does this history tell us to expect about this very volatile, complicated time we're going through. Brexit is being ferociously redebated in England as we speak. Eastern Europe seems to be taking the authoritarian path, but so do parts of Western Europe. The question of what does a weird transnational institution like the EU do to this story of national development, and has it in fact thrown a kind of monkey wrench into the work of liberal democracy by undermining this process of state formation that seems to be part of the story of democratization that Sheri tells. So those are just some possible suggestions for future conversation, and now I'll turn it over to Jack.
Thanks, Sandro. Well, let me just say right off the bat that this is a really wonderful book. It really deserves to be on the same shelf with the classic books that have tackled this topic and were seminal in the past. Barrington Moore, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, a book that the older people in the audience had to memorize when they were juniors in college. But also, it deserves to be on that same shelf with the most recent works that tackle the questions of political order and political decay, which is the title of Francis Fukuyama's 2-volume, 1,600-page tome. So don't complain that her book is a little too long.
No, I could say
compared to. Personally, I think we should take Fukuyama's second volume and just kind of the more recent several hundred years, throw that one out and put Sheri's in instead of it, and then his compendium of 2 would work better. Sandro's right that the case studies are wonderfully done. I mean, even those of you who have read already 10 books on the French Revolution, those books are also too long, and by the time you get to the end, you're not quite sure what take-home you should remember. But Sheri's case studies of that one and similar ones of the other European powers over 2 or 3 centuries have the benefit of being long enough to tell the juicy stories, to lay out all the complexity of the causal processes, but they're short enough that you don't wander off into a side byway in the woods and lose your way. You're always on track, which matches with how she's using social science theory. She's not hitting you over the head with a social science sledgehammer. But when you're reading the introduction, the conclusion, but also all of these wonderful historical case studies, especially with the social scientist's eye, you're saying, aha, here's how she brought in that hypothesis, and here's how she brought in that research finding, and it's just very satisfying to see how you managed to do that without messing up the narrative flow. This is an art, I don't know who taught you this, but they did a good job. So, Sheri's starting point is her absolutely correct view that the arc of history from dictatorship towards democracy is a marathon that happens in many steps. In fact, it's like a cha-cha, because you're going a couple of steps forward, you're going to the side, then you're going back, and maybe you get going again in the correct direction. So what you're doing in the course of this marathon, if you're lucky, is that you're dismantling the old order, the Ancien Régime. And you're, I think this is your view, but let's talk about it. Your first job is to focus on dismantling the old order. And I'm not sure whether you mean that kind of descriptively or whether you also mean that prescriptively. The old order is, one of the big words in this book is entrenched. It's not just the form of political authority, but it's also the form of economic relations and more broadly social relations that are imbricated with the political order, and just tearing down the political part doesn't move you as far along as you think, because the economy and the society are always there to drag you back, to provide stumbling blocks if you think you're just going to race forward and democratize an unreconstructed society right off the bat. Just the way I would put this is more my words, but it tracks with Sheri's argument. The Ancien Régime is, a form of traditional society that runs by some combination of repression and patronage. And the systems to do that are political, economic, and social. And in the transitional phases, where you're shaking things up, society is changing through natural processes of economic change from below, where the political leaders are responding to those changes with institutional and policy tinkering. Typically what happens in the French case before the revolution is her initial clear example of this. Actors trade power for privilege. So the French aristocrats surrender their power to the sovereign king, and in exchange get privileges granted by the king. So you wind up in a kind of hybrid form that has some attributes of a more modern system, but grafted onto elements of the old. And her relentless point in all of these examples is that as you gradually reform the system, you need to keep working at tearing down the remnants of the old. And as you're doing this, you also need to build the facilitating conditions of the new in order to wind up with a liberal, democratic, consolidated system, which includes economic development, institutions, not just of voting, but of rule of law, equality of citizens before the law. And the way I would put it, just more generally, in the language of modernization theory, you're going from personalistic social relations, where you favor your nephew and people in your clan and your ethnic group, to impersonal social relations, where you're just making a contract with someone who can supply you with goods or give you a loan based on impersonal rules. And it just takes a long way to get there. So, as Sandro said, 10 years or so ago, Sheri and I had a discussion in the pages of the Journal of Democracy, along with Tom Carruthers, where we were ruminating about whether there's a right sequence and a wrong sequence to undertake this marathon or this backwards cha-cha. And also whether you can fine-tune your influences on political change in a given country in order to get it to go in the right sequence more reliably, or whether it's just gotta be this like faithful long-term marathon with many awful detours. And so the right sequence, as Sheri lays it out in the book, and as Ed Mansfield and I argued in our writings at the time, was first you need to start with a modern state that has features of bureaucratic rationality. Then you need to layer on the nation, a group of people that sees themselves as distinctive and who deserves to rule themselves in their own state. And then finally you get to the point where democracy comes in, where they decide that democratic voting, and then finally liberal democratic rule is the way this nation state should be run. So my question for you, Sheri, about this is where capitalism comes in to this ideal sequence. The country that has this ideal sequence, you and kind of we all admit, is Great Britain. You absolutely correctly point out that even in the case of Britain, there was a great deal of messy politics. There were all sorts of strategizing by the not modern or not completely modern, or modern but not liberal actors that set things back even in Britain. But your bottom line is that Britain, starting with the state, going to the nation, and ending up with democracy, was doing it right. But my question, and I don't know the answer to this, where does capitalism come in? In your narrative, sometimes capitalism comes in as provoking crisis and as a disruption that causes setbacks. But sometimes it's the motor that moves modernization forward, and without economic modernization, the marathon, just stays, waltzing in a circle in one place. Okay, that's the right sequence with a question about capitalism. Then there's the wrong sequences. So you're very clear about what some of the wrong sequences are. So if you politicize the nation before you have a developed, rational, legal state, that exercises authority within a territory, that's really bad. That's East Central Europe. And you wind up with a bunch of different ethno-nations that are already politicized within a territory before it's a state, so they're all fighting to the death to monopolize the state on that territory. And what you wind up is with 100 years of ethnic cleansing until you finally wind up with a nation state. So you don't want to do nation before state. Another wrong sequence, and this you could theorize a little bit more for us and generalize, is the Italian case, where at one point you say capitalism and mass politics came before you had a state or a nation, and this was, in my words, a really backwards and inefficient way to dismantle the old order, that it was a sequence that led to fascism. And so that's just an observation about Italy, and I'm wondering kind of whether there's a more general take-home about that. Another bad sequence is late economic developers with a weak bourgeoisie, where the middle classes that are supposed to be an engine of democracy wind up fearing the rising working class and making a conservative alliance with the old regime elites, the old Barrington Moore point. And this is a wrong sequence. The way Sheri puts it is that, like, at the moment when that happened, you had in Germany the nation and the state going one direction, and the democratic forces, which previously had been on a unison track with the nation and state, veer off and separate from the nation. And so, again, for my point of view as someone who wants to know how to tinker with these processes, when we see this kind of Bismarckian diversion about to happen, where the older elites are playing the divide and rule card in order to separate the potential liberal democratic coalition. What's the right card to play if you're a liberal in that country, or if you're a liberal outside of that country? Some of us have written that China is kind of in that position now. So I'm wondering, how do we keep China from going in this Bismarckian direction? Then in the conclusion, you talk about structural shocks. And sometimes the structural shocks for you are good. War can smash, Hitler, the Japanese militarists, and sweep away huge chunks of the old order. Sometimes economic change, like the Spanish miracle, produced the Spanish middle class and Spanish dramatic economic growth, and basically left Spain a kind of ripe fruit that was ready to fall into the basket of liberal democracy as a result of positive economic change. On the other hand, there are plenty of structural shocks in your book, wars or the Great Depression, that derail democratic developments and cause setbacks. So there are these structural patterns of wrong sequence, but then there are also patterns that lead to wrong outcomes, perhaps wrong sequences, where it seems to be not just a feint of some structural misalignment like nation before state, but rather strategies and choices adopted by the actors. Bismarck's divide and rule, Bismarck's negative integration. Why was there not a liberal democratic guy who was as smart as Bismarck, who could have used some strategy that was at Bismarckian levels of astuteness, but going in the right direction? Call him, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson or something like that. And how do we think up those strategies? Okay, so that when we get to France later on, you do have an example of a strategic choice. You say that General Boulanger was a man on horseback who could have been kind of a populist military dictator that would have gotten support from the remnants of the old regime in France in the 1880s, 90s. But as a result of the Dreyfus affair, the French socialist leader, Jaurès, decides to align the socialist movement with the middle-class radicals in support of liberal democracy, rather than like running off the rails towards some militant, polarizing workers' movement. And so I'm interested in like having you generalize for us a little bit more about, you know, how we'll know that when we see it. Is there like a cookbook formula for that? Who can do that now in the United States, or, you know, that sort of thing? Which gets me to the conclusion in your description of what sounds like, you know, what in sports we would call an unforced error, where you, late in the book, you talk about the welfare state and the Bretton Woods system and how capitalism in the post-1945 period was melded efficiently with liberalism and democracy in a stable way, pretty much for the first time in history. And then, in a narrative that's, you know, rushes by pretty fast, the reader gets the impression that somehow in a fit of absence of mind, we forgot about this incredibly effective formula. Bretton Woods plus the welfare state. It was dismantled by globalization, by libertarians, some other themes in your story, supranationalists in the European Union, and okay, we're now in the land of backlashing populists who are recapitulating some of the battle patterns that you talk about in the book, whether it's Dreyfus or Boulanger or the first Napoleon or the third Napoleon. We're seeing all of this stuff again after the point where it should have been relegated to the dustbin of history, because it's happening in countries where the old order is pretty much thoroughly dismantled, and all the facilitating conditions of consolidated democracy are, you know, more or less in place. But so we're there. The marathon is ended, but somehow we're still dancing backwards. So those are my questions for you in your absolutely fabulous book.
Okay, well, thank you. That's an awful lot to respond to, and clearly there's a general theme here about the importance of quantity over quality. So if you write a large enough book, there's always going to be something to say, you know, sort of regardless. So that's a sort of a little piece of advice. But let me sort of start with some of the bigger questions or observations and see if I can make some sense of the kinds of things you and perhaps others are interested in. So this is definitely not a book that has one single overarching theory. That's not the kind of political science it is. But political science, as opposed to history, and this is a very historical book, is also very much about generalizations and patterns. And this is a book that's trying to figure out what some of the patterns in European political development are, and to use those patterns, to use those to gain a better sense of what political development looks like over time. That is to say, not just in Europe, but across the globe. So let me try to pull out what some of those patterns or generalizations or maybe even lessons are, and you know, maybe they'll be sort of more or less interesting, again, sort of based on some of the questions that I've got here. So this is a long historical treatment. It starts with the Ancien regime, and the reason for that is that one of the things that I think that the European experience allows us to sort of look at is how difficult it actually is to build successful democracies. So if you start with Europe, right, as opposed to countries that are newer, that is to say maybe formed in the 20th century or first started attempting democracy in the 20th century, one of the things that you realize about European history is that in a very generous sense, if we start this story with the French Revolution, right, this is a story, the struggle for democracy, that started in the 18th century and didn't finish until deep into the 20th century. Second half of the 20th century for Western Europe, last third of the 20th century for Southern Europe, and we're still kind of struggling with this process today in Eastern Europe. Now, I think that in and of itself is a profoundly important thing for us to recognize. Historically, how very, very long it's taken for countries to build democracy, right? So again, I use the term, it's a marathon rather than a sprint, but I think a cha-cha might be a good way of thinking about it too, because this is not a Whig history, right? This is not a story of history where there's constant progress, even if it's kind of, you know, slow and gradual. There's many, many movements backwards. And in fact, again, one of the other things you notice if you look about European history is starting with 1789, maybe even earlier if you would consider, you know, Cromwell and the civil wars in England, you had many, many, many transitions to democracy in Europe starting in the late 18th century. And up until the sort of second half of the 20th century, most of those failed. And the ones that succeeded for some period of time never got past what we would consider to be the electoral or the illiberal phase. That is to say, you had the procedures of democracy, elections, you had some of the institutions of democracy, parliaments, but you didn't have what we would consider to be liberal democracy, that is to say, full and equal application of the rule of law, respect for minority and individual rights. And so this vast scope of European history, I think, really enables us to see how very long and difficult the process of constructing democracy is. So that's a simple point, but I think it's one that's really very much important to remind ourselves of as we watch a lot of young democracies today really struggle to kind of build something that resembles successful liberal democracy. A second and related point, again, I think that both of my very generous interlocutors brought up, was that there is a very, very important distinction between getting rid of the old regime and building a new democratic. So the former is a prerequisite for the latter, but it's not the same thing. And again, one of the things that I think we can understand if we look at European history over the long arrays, how really hard it is to get rid of the Ancien regime. That is to say, how hard it is to get rid of the legacies of dictatorships. Because dictatorships don't only leave behind political legacies. They leave behind really profound social and economic ones. In the European context, not dissimilar to what you see in other places, this is societies defined by very strong status hierarchies, societies with norms of deep inequality, societies that do not have norms that treat people, all people, as political equals, economies that are, we're deeply embedded not only inequalities of resources, but inequalities of access to all different kinds of things, whether it's education or other kinds of means for social mobility. liberal democracy is simply impossible to build upon those kinds of social and economic foundations. And so one of the other themes is that getting rid of the political parts of dictatorships, right, is the very beginning of a process. That getting rid of those social and economic legacies of dictatorships takes much, much longer. And that even once you've done this, it still is just, again, the first stage in sort of clearing the brush that allows you to then start building liberal democratic regimes, right? Because you have to get rid of the legacies of dictatorships before you can build successful democracies. But those don't happen at the same time. That's why we have the term interregnums. And there are lots of these sprinkled throughout European history, right? Perhaps the most profoundly important one is the interwar period. So the interwar period gets a lot of treatment in this book. Not surprisingly, it's a book about Europe and democracy and dictatorship. And what happens after 1918 is that the political legacies of the old regime are gone everywhere in Europe. Monarchies disappear. Empires crumble. And so what we have now, finally in 1918, is all of the political structures of the Ancien regime disappear, right? And we have transitions to democracy everywhere. But what happens during the interwar years is a huge struggle goes on about what the kind of new regime is that should replace the old one. And there's no agreement on that, right? We have some people who favor democracy, we got some people who favor fascism, we got some people who favor communism. And so what you have during the interwar years is this kind of titanic struggle. Now that the old regime has been discredited, we know we're not going back to that anymore. Traditional dictatorship's gone, monarchy's gone. But we don't know yet what the new regime is going to look like. And these are extremely unstable periods. That is to say, times when, again, you've gotten rid of old regimes, but you don't yet have agreements on new ones. And so one of the other themes, again, that you guys brought up is how these things kind of move. What's so important about the post-1945 period, first of all, is that it is the first time we get stable liberal democracy in any part of Europe for an extended period of time, right? So the story of post-1945 is the story of liberal democracy finally becoming the norm in Western Europe, right? This was not the norm before 1945. We had some countries that had made transitions to democracy before then and remained democratic throughout the interwar years, but those are very few countries. We're talking essentially Britain and Scandinavia for the most part, right? All of the other countries that made transitions after 1918 failed. And so it's only after 1945 that that becomes a norm. And one of the things that we have to recognize, and I think this gets back to one of the points Jack makes, is how much absolutely has to change after 1945 to get that to happen. There are profound changes at the domestic level. That's the welfare states, social democratic post-war order, all of these kinds of things. Profound change at the regional level. We finally get a process of European integration, which was explicitly designed to help undergird the peace and prosperity that people now recognize were absolutely necessary for democracy to succeed in Europe after 1945. And of course, profound changes at the international level. We got a new international economic order supported by the United States and a new international security order supported by the United States. Without all three of those things, there would not have been successful liberal democracy in Western Europe after 1945. So we had gotten rid of the Ancien regime, and by the way, the last remnants of it were very well smashed by the Second World War, right? That's one of the ironic parts of the story, not just of European, but of other history, is that sometimes great tragedies like war can have oddly, I can't say beneficial effects because that just seems perverse, but they can have effects that you didn't foresee. And it is certainly the case that the Second World War played a profoundly important role in setting the stage for liberal democracy after 1945, not only, of course, by, again, bringing in the United States and bringing in European integration, but really by smashing many of the remaining social and economic legacies of the old order. The book talks about a whole bunch of them. Incredible ethnic cleansing that happens during and after the war, creating more homogenous nation states than ever before. In Germany, we finally get rid of those Junkers. We finally get rid of Prussia as a result of the Second World War. Hitler finally puts the Prussian military, the German military, under civilian control. All of these things only happen, ironically, as a result of this profound tragedy of National Socialism and the Second World War. So again, another theme is how difficult it is to get rid of the Ancien regime, but how that alone is not enough to build liberal democratic ones, right? What you have after 1945 is all of these new things that happen at the domestic, regional, and international level that finally allow liberal democracy to thrive in Western Europe. So that's, again, what I think the long durée gives you is an appreciation for how difficult this process is, an appreciation for the cha-cha nature of it, that it doesn't go in a linear fashion, the appreciation for the fact that there are different stages. Getting rid of the old regime is not the same thing as constructing a new one. The other thing, again, that I think is really important to point out, that both Sandro and Jack did, and I think that a lot of people are talking about today, again, is this distinction between democracy and liberalism, or between democracy and liberal democracy. As I mentioned, up through really the 20th century, whatever democratic transitions or experiments we had in Europe were essentially limited to the electoral or illiberal variety. We did not have successful liberal democracies in Europe. And again, once you think about historically what liberal democracy requires, as opposed to just electoral democracy, this makes perfect sense. Electoral democracy, right, means you have elections. They're relatively free and fair. You have certain kinds of institutions. You have parliaments, you have executives, you have judicial branches. But it doesn't say anything more than that. It doesn't require anything more than that. Liberalism, again, means something much more. It means governments willing and able to equally enforce the rule of law, to respect individual rights, to respect minority rights. And those things are much, much harder to achieve. Again, they go along, it's a little hard to talk about quickly, with those social and economic changes that only come relatively late in the game. So liberal democracy, even more than democracy, is an extremely, extremely rare and very recent occurrence, even again in Europe, which started this whole process in the late 18th century. And then let me say something about sequencing, because this is, I think, a really important thing to think about, and it's an important theme in political science as well. One of the things that looking at history over the long durée allows you to do is examine the interaction among state building, nation building, and democracy building. And what's nice about Europe is actually all the different patterns exist there. So if you look at Western Europe, classic British case, you had state building, nation building, and then you only got capitalism and democracy after the state and the nation were already in place. Makes it so much easier to deal with the challenges of capitalism and democracy if you already have a relatively strong state and you have relatively clear agreement on who the members of your polity actually are. Okay? Different patterns in different places. In Southern Europe, in Italy, for example, right? That sequence is much more compressed. You get the formation of Italy in the 1860s. The state is initially weak and corrupt. There's not a strong sense of nationhood. And soon after that formation, you get whacked with all of the challenges of capitalism and mass politics. That's really hard. That is really hard to do. It is very hard to deal with the challenges of capitalism and mass politics if you have a weak and corrupt state and you don't have an agreement on what it is to be Italian, right? Spain, another interesting pattern. An old state, but a very weak one, with a very weak sense of national identity. It brings both of those things up into the modern period, also meaning that it is much more difficult for Spain to deal with the challenges of democracy and capitalism because it simply does not have a strong state or a strong agreement on who the members of the nation actually are. And then, worst of all worlds, of course, is what you get in Eastern Europe, which is what you get in all decolonizing countries, which is state, nation, and democracy building all at the same time. So these countries become independent with the collapse of European empires after 1918, and then all of a sudden, they have to build states, build nations, and build democracy all at the same time. That is almost always a recipe for failure. And that's, of course, what we got in the interwar years in Eastern Europe. Those challenges simply could not be dealt with at the same time. And so, again, Europe gives us this interesting ability to play with these different sequences and variables and to gain some sense, as Jack said, I don't want to say which are more auspicious, but what the consequences are of dealing with these things in different kinds of ways. Again, it's not just which comes first, but really important is how compressed the time period is. There's something about overload that I think is simple but yet profound. If you have a country that has to deal with, again, a lot of challenges at the same time, building a strong, uncorrupt state, creating a sense of national identity, dealing with the challenges of capitalism and mass politics, that is really very difficult to do. And so the longer that's stretched out, the better. Let me see if I had anything else I wanted to add to this. And let me get back to one other thing that I'd love to talk a little about more, just because I think it has a lot to do with what's going on today. As I mentioned, you really only get stable liberal democracy in any extensive sense after 1945, and then only in Western Europe. And one of the things, again, that the historical perspective reminds us of is not just how unusual that was, but how much it took to build that, right? Those changes, as I said, at the domestic, the regional, and the international level. And I think once we recognize how much it took to build liberal democracy after 1945, we get a better sense of why it's having troubles today. And just, again, from a very simplistic perspective, but we'll talk about it more if anybody's interested, the decline of all three of the new structures and institutions and relationships that were put in place after 1945, the decline of those things over the last decades of the 20th century is a really critical part. It is impossible to understand democratic decay today if we don't understand the foundations upon which democratic success were built after 1945. So let me stop there. I don't know if I was able to respond to everything, but
I wonder, some questions that occurred to me while hearing you talk are something I've often thought about, looking at something like the Arab Spring. I've often found myself thinking and telling students, we shouldn't be too hasty to judge this. European history went through hundreds of years of bloodbath and failure for arriving at the sweet spot of liberal democracy. Does your history offer perhaps even some encouragement about parts of the world that struggled with this process? That's something if you want to think of something like the Arab Spring as in the Cha-Cha vein, a step forward and then a quick step or two back, or should we judge Saddam Hussein's Iraq more charitably than the Bush administration did? That he was in the process of state building and nation building in a very tough neighborhood. He was waiting for democracy to come along at some later point in the sequence. How can we, as I said, sort of read some of the other parts of the world through the lens of Europe as you've framed it in this book?
So I'm so excited that actually some of the folks who helped me teach this class are actually here. And so one of the things that I would say particularly about the Arab Spring is, I mean, for those of you who are historically minded, right, you probably know that that term Arab Spring has resonances of an earlier period in European history, right, which was the springtime of the peoples, which was 1848. And a lot of people who use the term Arab Spring didn't quite understand that, but clearly the resonance was there. And actually, unfortunately perhaps, it turned out to be a more fitting title than I think initially people understood, right? Because what happens in 1848, right? We have this huge democratic liberal wave that sweeps across Europe, right? This is a time, remember, we don't only not have social media, right? We don't have television, we don't have radio, and yet within the space of a year, all of these dictatorships that people had thought were impregnable, right? Just like, okay, you know, Mubarak would never go, they're just gone. They're gone, right? We have uprisings everywhere. And within the space of a year or two, there's nothing left. There's just nothing left. Now, why is that? Why is that? Well, there's lots of reasons, but one very simple reason is that, again, to go back to this point that I was making before, there is a huge amount of dissatisfaction with the old regime, the dictatorship in 1845, there is absolutely no agreement on what the new one should look like, right? So you can mobilize people remarkably quickly, given the right conditions, to overthrow dictatorships. And again, when faced with that kind of mass uprising, dictatorships have really two choices: immense repression, or they give in, right? And sometimes when the repression costs become too high, they give in. That's what happens in 1848. That's what happens eventually in the Arab Spring. But the problem is once the dictatorships are gone in 1848, all of those people who could agree that they didn't like the old regime could not agree on what they wanted to come after it. And so those opposition coalitions fracture, and the old regime, the conservatives, are able to pick off pieces of the opposition. It's exactly what happens in Europe. Now again, times are different, places are different, but that dynamic, that is really not one that is unique to the Middle East, right? And again, this was the first time in many parts of Europe that you had uprisings against dictatorship, first very, very initial attempts at democracy. And if you had been parachuted down as an alien in 1850 or 1851, you would have been like, why did they bother? Like, what was the point of this? It was a waste of time, there's nothing left. And in fact, the advantage of history is we actually know that that's not true. There were no successful democracies really after 1848, but with the benefit of hindsight, we do know that there were important processes that were set in motion that would play themselves out decades later. First time, most people, mass protests had really happened in many parts of Europe, that people had joined together to rise up against the Ancien regime. That the Ancien regime realized, you know what? If we continue to act in the old way, there's going to be problems. So we're going to have to make some changes, not democratic ones, but some changes. And we only see those processes really working themselves out decades later. So I would say, again, not to be too flip or too simplistic, look, the Arab world does not have a huge amount of experience with democracy. And the Arab Spring definitely, with the exception, glorious exception of Tunisia, did not leave behind democratic regimes. But this is not an unusual pattern, and it's not one that says that it won't work later, because that's simply not what history tells us. And again, I think the fact that the Arab Spring has this resonance from 1848 is a very good tool to help us think through perhaps what some of the correct historical lessons might be.
I want to jump in on this point. The ephemerality of the springtime of the people's style of protest. At one point in your book, you talk about the phenomenon that you call modernized protest. And you have a footnote to Chuck Tilley. And one of the points that Tilley makes in one of his mammoth studies of contentious politics is the difference between British protests, which he calls something like, like modernized protest in the 19th century, as opposed to the French style of protest. And so the British style of protest is you form an anti-slavery society. You form a society to undertake reform of the prisons. And it's something that you institutionalize. It's a social movement that where every day of the week for years there's some activity that your social movement engages in to kind of grind away at the establishment and create networks of people that are supporting change and that are piloting new ways of doing things. You wind up with the Fabian socialist society, and then you can contrast that to the flash in the pan style of French protests, whether it's 1848 or it's the French Commune in 1870. And he says it's hey kids, let's man the barricades. And so everybody goes and does that, but because there's no network or institutionalized infrastructure, there's no guiding intelligence. It just slips through your fingers. So the question is, why is it impossible to learn the lesson of how the British organized modern protest movements in the 19th century. You know, one of the advantages of being a late developer of anything, technology or political reforms, is that you can learn from the people who went before you, and you can learn that it works to do it the British way, and it doesn't work to just show up in Tahrir Square or to show up with your umbrella in Hong Kong, that you need to build institutions that are durable. And so why can't these flash in the pan stop and start democratizers learn how to do that?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I will say again, the other nice thing about studying over the long durée is, you know, you realize people look at something like the yellow vests today, and you're just like, well, there's a reason why we think about barricades in France, right? They've been doing this for hundreds of years, right? So, I mean, there are certain political styles that are not, you know, the yellow vests are not unpredictable. That's the kind of way the French do it. And the British have a very different style of, you know, sort of making their voices heard. And it's interesting, again, just to see how incredibly powerful those legacies are. But I would say that part of the reason for that is that there is a very powerful interface that goes on between institutional context and political behavior. And so if you're not interested in political science, since that sounds very jargony, basically what that means is that the reason why the British could sort of, you know, join together and peacefully present petitions to Parliament in 1848 when the rest of Europe was storming the barricades and, you know, sort of rioting, is because there was a parliament in Europe. There were institutions in Europe. There were already, particularly by the second half of the 20th century, the second half of the 19th century in Europe, pretty cohesive political parties, right? French political parties, they fall apart so quickly that honestly you need to have some kind of, like, you know, iPhone app to follow them, right? So I wrote a book on, you know, socialism in Europe in the late 19th to 20th century. I literally had to have a flow chart to follow all of the different splits that were going on within the French socialist movement. In those kinds of situations, it's extremely difficult to have organized long-term political movements because there's not the institutional infrastructure that allows that to happen. So that raises the question of why, right? So why? And a lot of that has to go back to some of the things that that you talked about and I talked about earlier. One of the advantages of the British was that after 1688, the political infrastructure remains pretty much the same. And so organizing around that, directing of demands towards it, is an option in a way it isn't even in a place like France, where institutions are changing constantly, right? Where there's constant political upheaval. And so institutions capable of channeling dissent simply don't exist. And so the way you make your grievances heard in that kind of situation is either you go out on the street, you scream and yell, or you form a new political party, which the French like to do all the time. And so that is just less effective, right? So again, this is where I think it's very hard to understand when you take snapshot analyses of political life, which political scientists like to do. So we look at what's going on in Italy today, or we look at what's going on in France today, and we try to understand it. Without seeing this backstory, I think it's very difficult to understand, again, why protests take certain forms in France as opposed to, you know, Britain, as opposed to Italy, as opposed to Spain. Why cleavages look like this in this place as opposed to that place. But again, you know, the things that we see in Europe have to do with this interface between what kinds of institutions facilitate or encourage certain kinds or patterns of political behavior as opposed to others.
One thing that occurs to me in following up on Jack's question, and something I was happy to see in the book, is there's a lot of thoughtful reference to political culture in these different places and the importance of ideas in different places. And so in talking about, for example, Bismarck's Germany, Bismarck's Kulturkampf and divide and conquer rule, and sort of painting parts of the population, the Catholics and the socialists, as not really part of the Volk, sets a very unfortunate precedent for things that come afterwards. In Italy, the fact that neither the socialists nor the Catholic Party really believed in democracy and were prepared to cooperate with the system meant that there was no one to defend it when the fascists came along. And similarly, divisions in post-revolutionary France created a kind of right that didn't regard as legitimate some of the governments that were elected democratically. Political culture matters, and the ideas in society matter, which makes me think some about this present moment where one feels and hears much more sort of disparaging thought about democracy, democratic institutions. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about political culture and the role it plays in your book.
So that's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it in exactly that way, but I think, again, one of the things that we can see when we have, again, a long perspective and lots of cases, which is the advantage, again, of studying Europe, is, you know, how much, whatever you want to think about it as, political culture or political behavior, how complicated the interface between that and, again, institutions and other kinds of things is. So, you know, the Bismarck example, I happen to have a particular fascination with German history, and Bismarck's kind of a sort of charismatic, if evil genius kind of figure is, I mean, you can very much see a lot of the, you don't want to have, again, a sort of warped wig view of history. This is a perspective on German history that I think has been largely discredited, but it's hard not to see a lot of the things that Bismarck did as having very direct, obviously, consequences for the problems that German democracy would face later on. So you mentioned, you know, this tendency to label people who he felt were opposed to him as enemies of the people, right? We've seen that in other places as well. It is an extremely dangerous thing, especially in the context of a young country with a fragile state of nationness and a sense of being surrounded by external enemies, right? So this was a very, very dangerous thing. It encouraged very deep and pernicious cleavages in German society, and it encouraged even further the tendency, again, to see enemies inside and without, right? And so you can see the consequences of that, and you can see the tragedies or the difficulties that created for German democracy down the road. And similarly, we can see some same kinds of things in other places. If we look at interwar Europe and some of the new countries that were formed after the collapse of empires, these incredible ethnic divisions that existed in these countries and how politicians played off them to create, again, certain kinds of political support for themselves, what we call today kind of ethnic outbidding, and to create minorities against each other, to try to mobilize a new sense of who belonged to the nation. So again, I think we can see a lot of different kinds of examples of the way in which people's attitudes, behavior, culture, norms, sort of evolved in interface with the actions of both elites and different kinds of institutional contexts.
Well, Jack, do you have another question or comment, or we can open it up to the floor, because I'm sure lots of you have questions you want to
open it
ask.
up.
Okay. Yes? Go ahead.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I'd like to ask a couple, maybe, turn on? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. This was very interesting, but I sort of thought I missed references to things that are fundamental. Democracy has never been complete until even today. There are always groups excluded or very limited power. It seems to me that that has something to do with establishing liberal democracies. The second point is, I hear a lot about building democracies, but nothing about maintaining and repairing democracies. I live in Brooklyn, a building that's red brick walls, and they are being repaired all the time. So if you build, I think you must, and that I think you touched upon it a little bit, but I would like the reaction. I believe that post-Cold War, especially that decade, I was at the UN at the time, everybody was very positive, and I think neglected paying attention to what's happening to democracies actually. And that's, for example, I do not, for example, think that Trump won the election. I think neglect by previous governors, and I mean the whole administration to the Congress, actually was very important. Same in Europe. I remember talking to a Council of Europe Commissioner of Human Rights, who Nils Muižnieks, in 12, he said he started talking to European statesmen about the fact that the war in Syria is generating a lot of refugees fleeing to the neighboring countries, but eventually they'll come to Europe. He said the only response he ever got is indifference. And in other words, the democracies have become largely reactive, but good democracies, I think, have to be proactive. They have to think ahead. So I'd like to have, I have not read your book, I'm sorry, but I would like to hear your reactions to what I think are very fundamental problems with the difficulties of not only building, maintaining democracy.
Sheri, go ahead.
So thank you. That's obviously a great question. I mean, liberal democracy, even when we talk about it as political scientists as being consolidated, doesn't mean that it's ideal. It doesn't mean that it can't be improved, right? It just means that it's sort of stable and fulfills some basic characteristics. And in fact, I mean, I think the pretty standard interpretation of the 1960s, for instance, which I don't have in my book because nobody would ever read a book that long, is that, you know, that was a recognition after the post-war period that there were parts of democracy that needed to be further completed or improved, that there were many groups that had been excluded from, you know, post-war democracy in some pretty fundamental ways. And the 1960s was really about kind of, again, I think deepening democracy, if you want to see it in that kind of longue durée kind of way. But the other point that you make, I think, is a really important one, right? Which is that I think that partially because our historical knowledge is so, or our historical memory is so limited, I think a lot of people did not recognize how recent and how incredibly fragile liberal democracy was. And so the very fact that we didn't have that in the forefront of our memory meant that we didn't, I think enough about how much it actually takes to maintain it. And putting aside this question about, you know, sort of the domestic, regional, and international levels and how those changed after 1945, on a broader level, if you look back at the debates about trying to bring democracy to Europe after 1945. And by the way, if you look back, you know, many people are just like, look, this is just never going to happen. This place is a mess. It's you know, we're going to try, but let's be honest, given the history, given communism, this is, you know, not a done deal kind of thing. One of the things that they recognized was that zero-sum politics, the politics of risk, the politics of unresponsive governments and elites, that this had to end, right? That people, in order to develop faith in democracy, to think of liberal democracy as legitimate, had to see their governments and elites as responsive. They had to not see politics as a zero-sum game. They had to believe that government and elites could protect them from, you know, whatever, the vicissitudes of capitalism, from economic risk, from economic insecurity. And there was a very clear sense that this had to be part of what was baked into the post-war system. Even the United States, right, which was most committed to, you know, sort of free market capitalism, understood that this was absolutely necessary if democracy was going to succeed in Europe after 1945. All of those insights, right, about what it would take to make democracy work, about what it would take to break the patterns of pre-war instability and dictatorship and democratic collapse, those basically disappeared over, you know, the 20th century. And so if you go back and you look at those conversations now, you can see, again, how much they understood about the fragility of democracy and how much they understood about what it would take to make it work. And I think, unfortunately, to a large degree, we lost that sense of, you know, what a delicate flower liberal democracy actually was.
Yeah, thank you. Nick Muller, History Department here in Columbia. I was very intrigued to hear from your presentation and the remarks that besides liberalism and democracy, it also seems that nationhood and nationness, as you refer to it, is is doing quite a lot of work, and as a historian I found it interesting because that's not oftentimes something I think that this kind of institutional story of political scientists engages with, or at least is known to engage with, so that sounded like something very interesting. But my question is, what is your model? Because I can see how there's a sort of minimal standard of liberalism, right, with individual rights and protection of minorities, and how you can define what institutional democracy requires. But what is the, especially in Europe, what sort of level of nationalism is the one that you consider important? Because it seems like it's playing an important part of your story. And the related question to that is, does the fact that nationalism is coming back very much in this day and age, or that it's perceived as being under threat, does the survival of liberal democracy depend on the preservation of nations in the present?
So these are big questions. Thank you. They give me a lot to think about. I'm not sure I can answer the last one, although you're right, this is one of the big questions today. I mean, one of the things I will say that, as far as nation is concerned, right, for liberal democracy, I think what there needs to be is a consensus on who the people are. That is to say, who deserves the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. That was something that it took a very, very long time to get agreement on. And that, I think, is an absolute necessity for a liberal democracy to function. One of the other things that's really interesting from European history is the very different ways in which nations, so to speak, are built. So perhaps, again, not surprisingly, I imagine most people in this room are pretty knowledgeable about European history. For much of European history, that was a very violent process, right? It was basically what we would consider today to be ethnic cleansing. It was, you're a Protestant in France, sorry, you don't belong here, right? Or you're a Catholic in Britain, sorry, you don't get equal rights. Or you're not Polish in Poland, sorry, you don't belong, right? So one of the things that the book talks a lot about is the different ways in which nations were constructed and the different ways in which dictatorships and democracy did that. So for the most part, dictatorships have a tendency to build nations through violence, through ethnic cleansing, through forced homogenization, through the repression of minority cultures and rights. Democracies have other options. They don't always take them, but they do. And the classic case of this, of course, is the peasants into Frenchmen Third Republic, right? Which is not without violence, but can be done through other means, through the creation of national symbols, through education systems, through things like that. But what has to happen for liberal democracy to work is there has to be an agreement on who's entitled to be a citizen, who's entitled to the rights and responsibilities within your country. But again, something that the book talks a lot about is the different ways in which this was accomplished, again, under dictatorships and democracies, and the different types of nations that come out of those processes, whether they're more ethnic-based, right, which is, okay, we're all whatever, we're all Polish, we're all Catholic, we're all whatever, versus a more, if you want to call it civic-based kind of idea of nationalism, which is we're all educated in the same ideas, we all believe in the same history, that kind of thing. But if there's not that agreement, it becomes, I do not find cases in European history where you're able to get successful liberal democracy. Whether that pattern can be transcended today, which some people are hoping and other people's fear, that I can't say.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dana Schmaz. I'm a visiting postdoc at the New School. And so I understand that the book is very open to look at different patterns, different circumstances, and yet there seems to be, or there necessarily has to be, certain theoretical assumptions or interpretative narratives, and I would like to understand these better in two regards. The first is regarding how can lessons be drawn for the global context. And there seems to be the narrative that there's one right development, there's one goal where liberal democracy has to go, and there are different timelines. So we're speaking about young democracies. And another narrative which would contrast this would be to say, well, there are various forms of functioning for societies, even democracies, and the European has achieved a sort of hegemony globally, and that is why, well, there are failures in Europe, but also by trying to fit in this hegemony hegemonic international system, younger democracies have a hard time. So just to contrast this narrative and ask, how would you describe it? And the second one is more regarding the interpretation of democratic success, democratic decay in Europe. Again, the narrative seems to be that there's one direction and for some reason, steps back. And a different story again would be to say liberal democracy has its very internal contradictions, and what we see as rising populism and authoritarianism now in part is a reaction to these internal contradictions. I would just like to hear you.
Thanks. So I don't want to give the impression that the book has a kind of teleology to it, because I actually I like and wish I had used the sort of the cha-cha kind of analogy, because I think that's kind of right, which is, you know, there's a kind of dancing around. I think there does seem to me to be, and maybe I'm letting my own normative biases in here, although as a social scientist, of course, I want to think that I'm not. You know, I think that there is, if you look back in history, right, there is a desire for what you might call self-rule. I think generally people don't like to be ruled by others, or rather, I think the way dictatorships work, again, to use political science terms, is they can have performance legitimacy, but really probably, with few exceptions, not more than that, right? So, you know, if your dictatorial regime says, look, I can give you better economic growth, I can protect you better, then people may be willing to support that as long as that regime delivers the goods. But once it stops doing that, it has very little generally to offer, right? And so I think there is a kind of universal desire for people to rule themselves. Doesn't always win out, but I think that that's kind of there. But that doesn't say anything about whether or not democracy, much less liberal democracy, will succeed. And again, I think in European history we see, again, lots of waves. I mentioned two, 1848, 1918, pretty much fail. I mean, there's very little left of them, you know, not too many years afterwards. So there's not a teleology here, and in fact, to get back to some of the earlier questions, I think that if you see the period where we had some success after 1945, not only, again, was that unusual, but it took an incredible amount of stuff to make that happen, right? Stuff not being a very scientific term, right? So there's not a teleology here. In fact, the book is very much about how much more frequent transitions are than consolidation, how much backsliding there is, how very unusual successful liberal democracy, however defined, is. So I think that that's a really important lesson, and I think that that's one that maybe to get back to the question about the Arab Spring, might give us a slightly different perspective on what's going on in the world today, right? Which is, I'm not sort of as surprised by some of the failures of third wave countries as maybe other people were, because again, having seen this process play out in the past, I wouldn't expect, especially initial first and second tries, to be successful, because it takes a lot to build up the infrastructure, normative and institutional of successful liberal democracy. And also, to get back to your other question, there were so many different paths within Europe to get to whatever, you know, some kind of successful democracy. So there's lots of different ways that European countries got there. Like I said, the Spanish pattern is very different from the German pattern, it's very different from the British pattern, it's very different from the French pattern. So I think there's lots of different patterns. I think that almost any country probably can eventually achieve liberal democracy, but I never would expect it to be quick or easy. That's the only firm conclusion that I can say based on my analysis of these many too many cases.
I think we have time for one more question, then we'll wrap it up. Back there.
So, Sheri, on to your last comment there, hasn't it been easier and smoother in Scandinavia, at least until just recently, with, you know, especially in Sweden, but in the other Scandinavian countries, that very rapid diversification ethnically, and the chauvinism that's bitten back from that has been vicious, especially in Sweden. But overall, I mean, from the Lutheran state church in the Reformation era through a relatively smooth industrialization, and a little bit different from Jack, you're citing Tille, talking about sort of civil society, protest orientation, and a thousand flowers blooming. In Scandinavia, I would say it's been more like a set of pontoon boats making their way down the river, this corporatization of groups, labor, peasants, owners kind of cooperatively finding their way. That's somewhat of a different pattern from the overall I'm hearing, and I wonder, knowing your interest in Swedish social democracy in particular, how you've thought about comparison contrast between Scandinavian democratic development, arguably, in my opinion, the deepest the world has known, and Europe overall.
So, I mean, it's nice to end with a question about Scandinavia because I'm a bit of a Scandinavia file. I would say that those are probably the countries that best approximate, even more, I would say, than Britain, a kind of relatively, and I say relatively, smooth transition to sort of liberal democracy, right? So there's a lot of problems, I think, with general interpretations of the British case. Just to kind of, I know we're out of time, but if you look at the sort of concentrations of wealth and power that existed in Britain during the 19th century, I mean, it would make plutocrats today kind of blush. So, I mean, yes, there was a lack of violence and there was gradualism, but the price paid for that was fairly high as far as a whole variety of social and economic things are concerned. The Scandinavian cases look much better. They were both gradual and without some of the economic and social inequalities and status hierarchies that came along with the British case. But those are really unusual. They stand out precisely because of that. So they exist, but they're very, very rare.
Okay. Good note to end on. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Sheri, for